All right, welcome everybody. My name is Calandra Waterslake. I'm Executive Director of Wild Virginia and very excited to be hosting this responsible wildlife photography webinar. We have a couple wonderful and experienced guests with us today. But before we really get into the details of the webinar, I wanted to make sure to go over a couple things about Wild Virginia in case some of you are kind of new to what we do. We're a conservation nonprofit. We work to protect and connect Virginia's wild places. And we do that by focusing on things like habitat connectivity, which involves wildlife crossings and corridors, as well as water quality. We work to keep things like PFAS, a forever chemical, from being released into the environment, and also work on the Mountain Valley Pipeline and other natural gas fracking pipelines. And then we do a lot with outreach and education, including things like this webinar. So how we do that work is a lot of advocacy. We work with decision makers, policymakers, communities, everything in between. And we really work to convene a lot of different groups to make progress on habitat connectivity and water quality, and as well as empowering communities and connecting people to the outdoors through things like this event. If you like our work, which if you're here, I'm assuming you do, I hope that you will consider donating to Wild Virginia. We are actually in a fundraiser right now, and tomorrow is our last day. So if everybody here donated $10, we would make about $400 towards our goal, and we're only about $1,500 away from it. So I hope you will consider doing that. You can use the QR code right on your screen to go to our donation page. With that, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our panelists today. So we are excited to be hosting Lori Cash. She's owner of Lori A. Cash Conservation Photography, LLC. She's a conservationist, wildlife and nature photographer, writer, blogger, and storyteller. Lori co-founded the Responsible Photography Collective and is passionate about bringing awareness to the decline of habitat for migrating organisms, such as the monarch butterfly. She's been published in National Wildlife, Virginia Wildlife, American Butterflies, Nature Vision magazine, plus many other publications over her 34 years as a photographer. We also have with us today Stephen David Johnson. Stephen David Johnson is a conservation photographer and professor of visual and communication arts at EMU in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. His photography of the natural world has appeared in Wildlife Photographer of the Year, Nature Conservancy Magazine, Ranger Rick, Virginia Wildlife, Biographic, and Orion. Steve serves on the advisory boards of Virginia Wilderness Committee, Girls Who Click, and the Nature Expanse Initiative. When he's not in the office, you'll probably find him crouched next to a vernal pool or kayaking the North Fork of the Shenandoah River. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Stephen first to kick us off and tell us a little bit more about the basics of responsible wildlife photography.
Okay,
Stephen,
thank you so
I'm
much.
going to stop sharing my screen and it's up to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We'll be doing a little passing back and forth tonight. Okay, can everybody see okay? Maybe, okay, I'm seeing heads nod, so that's good. Okay, so I'm going to give a little kickoff with a few minutes just talking about some of the basics of responsible wildlife photography, and then I'll turn it over to Lori to get into some more specifics. So first thing, maybe this goes without saying, but maybe in our world it doesn't. Wildlife doesn't exist for photographers. Instead, photography is a way of communicating about the importance of what people sometimes refer to as the more than human world. So the welfare of your subject is ultimately what's important. And that means it's also really important to watch for things like stress in your subject. One of the things that I find really helpful with this is learning about the natural history of your subject and their behaviors. So to do that, I often work with scientists or I go on natural history field trips to learn more. In fact, Wild Virginia has been a really important part of that for me. The kind of vernal pool work that I'll show you a little bit later in this presentation, going on a field trip with Wild Virginia was really important for me to start to understand that subject. In this particular image, I have been documenting a group of foxes that lived on the North Fork of the Shenandoah River. Oh, I just see a raised hand. Kylie, were you intending to raise your hand?
No,
Oh,
I'm
okay.
sorry about that.
Okay. Just wanted to check in. So as I was documenting this fox group, I started to realize that there was this time every day, midday, where they would come down to the river when it was hot and dry and grab a drink. And so kind of understanding that natural history behavior gave me a much better sense of when I could show up and just be quiet and observe as a photographer. And I've also gotten to know a lot of wildlife as individuals. So, for example, I'm doing a project on beaver families right now. And over time, I go out every night and these beavers get to know me as a photographer. So it's kind of a reciprocal relationship. At this point, even though Lori will talk about giving your wildlife subjects a respectful distance, these beavers actually choose to swim up to my kayak because they've gotten to know me over time and realize that I'm not a threat to them. And they'll let me know if I'm doing it wrong. I get rewarded with a tail slap on the water if I'm not doing it right. Another great way to understand wildlife behavior is to look for clues during the day. So I'll often spend time looking for paw prints, chewed sticks, wildlife scat, and then I set up a trail cam and kind of verify what my hypothesis was about what happened, often during the evening. So here I set up a trail cam, and when I came back, I got to see this beaver digging into a young cottonwood on the North Fork of the Shenandoah. Trail cams can be a really great low impact way of seeing what wildlife are doing during the night without having to use things like flashes or disturbing wildlife that are otherwise out for a quiet evening. So a few other principles in mind before I turn it back over to Lori. One, try to keep a low impact on the environment. I'll talk about that more specifically with some of my underwater work later. But moving slowly, paying attention to where your feet are. Two, thinking about locations. So some of the wildlife photography you see that's out there was actually made at a game farm. And generally, conservation photographers frown on this practice. And it's totally fine to go to accredited zoos or wildlife centers as long as you reveal that in the captions. But there are unscrupulous players out there who raise animals specifically for photographers, oftentimes in situations that are not great for the animals. And then finally, keeping locations vague when you're posting about sensitive species. We have a number of rare and endangered species in Virginia, including some species of turtles like wood turtles. Because people around the world will collect and poach these turtles to sell in other places, it can be really important not to reveal locations, especially in the age of social media. And then there's the issue of authenticity, especially in an age of AI. This can be important to your captioning process too. So how do you communicate about your images? So the image on the right here is actually authentic, even though it has a dark black background. That background just dropped out because of the lighting that was on the heron and the exposure that I was using. On the other hand, you've probably seen images in social media feeds that include things like frogs in really unnatural positions, dancing on top of a mushroom, riding on a beetle. If you see something like that that seems like, wow, that might be too good to actually have existed, it probably is. There are wildlife photographers. Well, I'll put wildlife in quote, photographers who will string frogs up and then erase the wires using Photoshop to get these sort of spectacular looking images, but of course are really cruel to the subject. And now in the age of AI, we're seeing a lot of generated subjects. So really spectacular looking birds, but ones that never actually existed. And even things like camera tricks can be deceptive. So this is a image that my wife took of me. I had been seeing this cat image going around on the internet. And I thought, oh, that would probably be easy to reproduce. It's a simple camera trick. You can do this with your phone. If you hold your arms way out and hold up your pet, it will look huge. But of course, this is a thing that never really existed. My cat's a normal sized cat, a little chubby, but not gigantic. Okay, I want to end this section by saying photographers aren't the enemy. Sometimes I've gone to talks like this where you come away thinking, oh man, the biggest challenge to wildlife in the world is that people are photographing wildlife. And that is very much not the case. It's important for photographers to be ethical and to consider the welfare of their subject utmost. But photographers can do a huge amount by their communication, by conservation photography, to make the world a better place. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Lori, and we'll come back and take a look at macro and underwater photography in a little bit.
Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate that. Well, let me share my screen with everyone. Okay. Hope everybody can see my screen. I'm glad to be here, and I'm very excited to talk about this special topic of mine, responsible wildlife photography. It's a important issue that I've been working on for a number of years. As a side note, I do want to share that I do have myasthenia gravis and stiff person syndrome. So you may see my eyelids close or my voice fluctuate during this presentation. Just having a little trouble advancing my slide. Here we go. Okay, what I wanted to talk about today was my top 3 responsible wildlife photography tips. And mostly these come from my out in the field experiences in the last couple of years, actually. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about this. Stephen had mentioned some of it, but you always want to try to keep a respectful distance from wildlife. Number 2, you want to know your subject and their behaviors, something that Stephen touched on as well. And if you see something in the field, say something. And that's being a responsible photographer. And these are my 3 biggest tips. First, as we were talking about distance, is that this was at a refuge in North Carolina. This bear, we were driving, it's a wildlife drive. We were driving down the gravel road very slowly, and we saw the big bear starting across the street. So we stopped at a very far distance. I got out of the car and just used the side of the car as a blind, kind of sort of as a blind. So I was still at my using my very long lens and capturing this animal just walking on it. I didn't interfere with them. I was at a long distance, and it actually I got a nice little turn of the head. So so that was good. And also with this bear, I was also at the same wildlife refuge on a gravel road, and I was shooting outside the passenger car side of the car with my beanbag and my 600mm lens, and I got this nice head straight on look of this bear that was grazing in the grass, quite a distance from the car. And then when we talk about big animals, bison comes to mind. And last year I went to Yellowstone and saw a lot of bison. Bison, these two bison were beginning to spar over dominance of their territory. Now, when this was happening way out in the field, I was way back in the parking lot, just hand holding my 600mm lens and staying at a far distance. Now, a lot of times, if you've been to Yellowstone or the Tetons, you will see this, where the animals will come upon the side of the road, they'll graze, they'll cross the road, they'll get close. This is a couple bison right at the parking lot. And we had just pulled into the parking lot when the bison started getting closer to the parking lot. So we just decided just to sit there and watch for a few minutes. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't roll the window down. We just watched. And while we were there for just a few minutes, there was about a group of guys. They were within, I mean, really within 3 to 5 feet of the bison, trying to do selfies. And I told those guys that they had to, then I rolled my window down, and then I told the guys they had to be at least 75 feet from those bison, because people get gorged by bison. You know, these guys were very lucky that they weren't injured. Also, I have had the opportunity to photograph a family of foxes, and this was in a very familiar place. I came upon it by accident, by scouting, where there are dozens of other photographers knew about it. But you'll see the family, you'll see the male, the vixen is there with the kids. They were feeding at the time. And after a few weeks of the kids moving around the mound, they began to explore the territory, and would get closer, because there was a pretty distance road between the dune and the grass field, where I always stayed back in the grass field. But I was sitting down in the grass field when suddenly, just being patient, waiting for some action, and I was able to capture that lovely moment between the mama and the kid. And this is just a vixen watching. You just got to be aware of where you are. When they start roaming around, you want to make sure you're still in a respectful distance. And this kid got pretty close to me. I was down on the ground, and I was thinking I was going to have to scooch back, but luckily the kid just decided, looked at me, well, so what, turned around and walked off. This is the the most important thing for me is if you see something in the field, you want to say something. And this has happened to me several times, many times over, a course of the 34 years I've been photographing, and especially in the last few years as more young photographers and cell phone photographers. A lot of people are, becoming very into photography. And what I wanted to talk about was sharing the shore. And when you're on the shore, be careful of the shorebirds. This piping plover was endangered or threatened, I believe, when I photographed it. And I was just laying down on the ground, just waiting for something to walk by. And luckily this plover walked by right in front of my lens, and I got a great close-up shot of that piping plover. Now this is a western snowy plover, and at the time that I photographed it, it was 2 years ago. It was endangered, and now it's on the threatened list of species. But I was there with a photographer friend, and we were down in the ground photographing the western snowy plover when my photographer partner had heard, I didn't hear or notice, that a person with a dog was walking straight towards us and towards the plovers, and she just turned her head and said, no dogs are allowed in this area because we have endangered species. So that's very important. And it's important to say something, even if it's another photographer getting too close, or if it's just an individual getting close. But there's a lot of shorebirds and a lot of colonies that are on the beach these days, like a bunch of skimmers and terns, and usually those are caution tapes, so that to make sure that nobody goes beyond that, to give them their distance so their nesting behaviors can continue on as normal and not be disturbed. And so when you do go to a beach, whether you're a photographer or walking a dog, be mindful of the shorebirds, and don't approach too closely to the shorebirds, and just keep that. It all kind of ties back in. It's just, you want to keep the respectful distance. You want to say something if you see something out in the field. And and much what Stephen had talked about is you want to know the behaviors of your subjects and be patient, and that will give you a lot of opportunities to capture some wonderful images if you just be patient and stay respectful distance. And then this is actually one of the colonies that was out on the Outer Banks that had the caution tape, and I was outside the caution tape. I think I was there pretty much alone, and I just laid down on the ground. I was having to use extenders. I think I had my 500mm lens at that time and was using extenders. But these chicks, for their survival, we have to pay attention to wildlife and be respectful of wildlife and their behaviors, their normal behaviors, and not to do anything to disturb their behaviors, because that, and when we disturb their behaviors, we see decreases in population, a lot from the shorebird side from human environment. So for humans, it's very important to keep the distance, the shorebirds and the little babies, even for the fox dens and the pups and the kits. So you want to keep that safe. And and I want to just give a moment to talk about a website and blog that I co-founded with a fellow photographer, Angela Maloney, and we started this a couple of years ago, and we have a website and a blog, and we do monthly blogs where we have regular and guest blog contributors. So every month we put out a blog by a different contributor that has a topic of responsible photography. And we also try to advocate for not just wildlife photography or nature, but for all genres of photography. And we have a resource page which that has links to all the different types of genres of photography, the guidelines, the best practices, ethical standards. So we have that, and we actually just started a page not too long ago on Instagram, so you can follow us at Responsible Photo on Instagram, and we would love for you to come and check us out at Responsible Photo. And we're always looking for new regular contributors or guest blog contributors. But this is a great resource, especially if you're new and just starting out in photography. We have a lot of resources available on this website, and it's there to try to promote and to advocate for responsible photography in general. So that I've concluded my part of the presentation. I will now pass it back over to Stephen. So let me share.
Okay, thank you, Lori. I'll just mention as an aside that even though I'd been following Lori's work, getting ready for this webinar was the first time we actually met. So that's been really lovely, and I love your work. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and talk about macro and underwater photography, which of course, by its very nature, looks a little bit different than some of the work that Lori was just showing. So sometimes I do work with a 600 millimeter lens and have a distance when I'm photographing foxes and beavers and so on. But this is work that requires that you get fairly close. And that requires a different set of techniques. So I thought I would actually start off giving you a little bit of a sense of what I do in the field. So I'm going to show you a short video that shows some of the behind the scenes work with my vernal pools project. My name's Steve Johnson. I'm a conservation photographer and a university professor. Conservation photography is nature photography plus using that photography for advocacy work or protection of the natural world. I also think of it as having more of an ecosystems approach. So not just pretty pictures, but thinking about the big picture. With my conservation photography work, I moved to Virginia in 2005. And pretty soon I discovered that the biodiversity story here was salamanders. We have more than 50 species in Virginia alone. So I realized if I was going to be telling stories about the natural world, it was going to involve salamanders. I became really fascinated. I wanted to understand what their life cycles were about and document this portion of their life when they came above ground and went to these pools to breed. That's what's led me to the last 9 years of a vernal pools project. Vernal pools are special because they're ephemeral. They don't last. They're seasonal. So it's only at certain times of the year that you're going to see water. And that keeps them fish free. And because they don't have fish in them, there's a whole range of amphibians that can breed in there in relative safety. So you have some really unique environments. I use video lights and macro photography and underwater cameras to try to bring people much closer to these creatures. And when you see them in detail, they're amazing. They're like the types of things you might find in a tropical coral reef, but they're right here in the Appalachian woods. North America has the highest biodiversity of salamanders found anywhere in the world. Here in Appalachia, we have this amazing diversity of these creatures. Sometimes I think of them like hidden dragons. So in addition to salamanders, you can find macroinvertebrates, you can find crustaceans. I photograph things like berry shrimp, tiny little copepods, daphnia, beetle larvae, dragonfly larvae, caddisfly larvae. There's all sorts of things that are completing life stages. It's a kind of hidden diversity that most people don't see unless they know what to look for. Okay. So yeah, clearly a different sort of approach. You may have noticed there was a caption in the film that I made with Alex Wiles, another wildlife filmmaker there, that said we had filmed some of that in a stream location to avoid degradation. And that was because there were two of us moving fairly quickly, and we didn't want to be mucking up a vernal pool doing that. But there's a lot of other things to keep in mind when you're photographing salamanders and frogs and other small creatures. For example, amphibian skin is incredibly sensitive. So I try to avoid using things like sunblock and bug spray when I'm working in these types of environments. There's also amphibian disease that's spreading across watersheds. You may have heard of things like chytrid fungus. So to try to avoid transmitting any diseases between watersheds, if I'm wearing waders to go into some of these environments, I disinfect them with a 10% bleach solution and make sure I get any mud off from the boots of those waders. Now, oftentimes when I'm working in vernal pool environments, I'll actually just perch at the side of the pool, especially if it's a small pool. But other larger pools, I'll enter that environment using waders. And in that case, I'm just moving very slowly and very deliberately. And I'll show you some more images of what that looks like in just a moment. One of the things that I think about is trying to minimize sediment disturbance when I'm working in underwater environments. And that's for two reasons. One, it's just a lower impact on the environment. Two, it's really important from a photography standpoint. So if you kick up a lot of dirt, it's going to make it very difficult to make an image of your subject. And I'll back up and say, one of the reasons I find this work so important is because most people simply don't know what lives in these environments, or sometimes that these environments even exist. When I go out to some of the vernal pools, sometimes they look like glorified mud puddles. In fact, I was out at a pool once and I was photographing salamander eggs, and somebody in an SUV came and drove right through my pool. And they saw me and they stopped and said, "Hey, buddy, what are you doing?" And I was actually able to do a little bit of education and say, "Hey, I'm photographing salamander eggs." And when they realized that, they were very, apologetic and had a much better sense of what that environment was. But that's what I see as really important in my work, is taking something that's largely invisible to people and making it visible. Now, there's lots of other ways of getting out there and photographing creatures that live in aquatic environments. For a lot of my work, I'm out kayaking in the rivers. That's when I'm using a telephoto lens. I also do river snorkeling, which is a great way to limit sediment kicking up because you can just float along the surface. And some of my work doesn't involve creatures that can respond at all. For example, I love photographing spotted salamander eggs. They're incredibly beautiful. They show part of the life cycle. And of course, at this point, they're not moving. So I can perch at the edge of a pool, move in fairly close with my camera, and be very careful about not stirring up the sediment. Another example. I use different types of underwater cameras for different situations. Here's pull off the cap of this. This is one of my underwater cameras that has a dome lens on it. And this is what I use for underwater photography. Lighting can be a really important part of this. And because sometimes I only have a very brief window to work with subjects, I do a lot of practice. In fact, I practice on Star Wars figures. So I found that Yoda is a really good stand-in. And that means when I'm out there and maybe I only have a tiny bit of time to work with a subject, or I need to limit my impact, I can work very quickly. There are also terrestrial settings when it comes to macro photography. And I find that at all times of the year, I have to move very slowly and deliberately and scan the environment because you never know what might be underfoot. Wood frogs can be out in Virginia even when there's snow on the ground. Sometimes my subjects are under cover objects. When I take students out from EMU, one of the first things that I show them is how to lift and replace cover objects safely. So oftentimes you'll find salamanders under logs or rocks. And what I tell my students is you want to lift those logs or rocks straight up, move them, and then sometimes you'll find a salamander or a frog there. You want to photograph them fairly quickly because their skin can dry out if they're exposed to the atmosphere for too long. And then it's really important that they have a safe place to be when I put the cover object back. So sometimes they'll move off of their own accord. Other times I'll take a wet leaf and just kind of gently move them, place the log back, and then let the salamanders crawl back under that log of their own accord. When I'm working at night, I'm often thinking about the impact that light might have on my subjects. So I try to diffuse my light. So if you're using a flash, you can use a diffuser over your flash or other types of lighting. Even with a phone, you can do this. And not only is that helpful to your subject to reduce impact, but it's going to make for much more natural looking lighting on something like a salamander or a frog that tends to have shiny skin when it's wet. Here's some other examples. Photographing at night, spring peeper, an American toad with diffused lighting. The green frog that you see at the bottom left, that's actually natural diffused light. So working on an overcast day that's cloudy can produce really beautiful lighting for macro work. If you're interested in learning more about some of this work, including some really particular types of camera techniques, some of the conservation challenges that various amphibians in Virginia are facing, I have co-authored a book called Vernal Pools, Life in Temporary Ponds. It's an ebook that's available for a free download. So you can go to my website, and it's hosted by the North American Nature Photography Association. And I'll end up talking a little bit about conservation photography in general. So part of my practice as a responsible photographer is trying to give back. These are landscapes and creatures that offer so much to me as a person. So it's important for me to give back with my images. And that leads to the idea of conservation photography, which combines nature photography with environmental advocacy and also a broader ecosystems approach to understanding the natural world. So part of my practice is actually involved Wild Virginia. The Atlantic Coast Pipeline, before the MVP, was a really important part of my practice, trying to document the potential impact of that pipeline, documenting rare creatures like the rusty patch bumblebee that were in the path of the pipeline. Also, I've been donating images for some of the habitat connectivity projects for Wild Virginia. And I work with a constellation of organizations to try to communicate about why we should care about the more than human world, which a term, by the way, I've used a couple times and was coined by the author David Abrams. I also love this quote from David Abrams. Direct sensory perception reveals the things around us to be not inert or inanimate chunks of matter, but enigmatic elemental presences with whom we find ourselves in relationship. And ultimately, that's what it's about for me. It's a sense of relationship and encouraging that relationship for all of us. So I'll go ahead and end there, and I'll head back to this slide in case you want to download the book.
Thank you, Stephen and Lori both. Wild Virginia is very lucky that you all have let us use your photos. We really appreciate the donations of your work. Almost all of our photos come from you all, so we love showcasing that. Really allows us to make outstanding points in our advocacy. I wanted to step over to some of our Q&A for a moment. So we have a couple questions for you all. One of them was about what you are wearing. And Stephen, I know you mentioned a little bit about this as well, and asked, is what you wear when you're photographing specific to the habitat or to the organisms that you're taking pictures of?
Yeah, I mean, you saw some pictures of me in waders, so that's important gear for me. And again, I do disinfect those with a bleach solution. Otherwise, when I'm out photographing things like foxes or mammals, I often just wear kind of plain earth-colored clothing. It's quick dry field gear. I want to be as unobtrusive as possible. I don't know if Lori has any suggestions.
Sorry, I muted myself. Yes, and I agree with you. I usually wear earth tone type clothing. I also I've learned to where, especially when I get down in the sand, is where the bring pants over my regular pants that I use out in the field. So if I get all sandy and stuff, I can just, they zip up on the side and I can just, get rid of them if I'm going on to a different type of subject. And I generally just don't wear white and bright colors and just, keep it simple with dark colors.
Thank you. Lori, the next one is for you, and it's about the bison. So I wanted to know, are the bison in the park used to humans and cars since they're so close to the parking lot?
Some, yes, are. But there's too many people that get injured by the bison that I don't think, they're adapted to their natural land that they have there. And we're the ones being really intrusive. But even though they may feel comfortable getting close, it's still very wise to stay a far distance from the bison, especially the bison, because that's a dangerous.
Thank you, Lori. Stephen, we have one for you in regards to your Star Wars figures. And they wanted to know if there are any other exercises that you suggest to do from home like that to practice photography.
Yeah, so I teach photography and digital media at EMU, so I'm often thinking about, what's helpful from a teaching perspective. I find online tutorials, photographers post these on YouTube all the time, incredibly helpful. So I'll often tune in and then practice techniques. So in addition to Star Wars figures, sometimes just in my house, I'll photograph things like plants. I'll practice with different lenses. Sometimes in my backyard photography is a great way to practice. And sometimes those images, like some of the frogs I showed you, can be publishable images in their own right.
Nice. Do you all have any suggestions for new photographers on the photographer starter kit? Are there sort of certain things that you would suggest that they have in order to go out there and do responsible wildlife photography?
You want me to? I can jump in. I can say.
Whoever would like to.
Okay, I can say, make sure if you're going to do wildlife photography, make sure, and you're going to do big animals, you really want a lens that is anywhere from 400 to 600 millimeters. That way you can stay far enough. But if you're just starting out, somewhere medium range telephoto lens is good to have.
I'll mention, the lenses that Lori's referring to. I have a 200 to 600 millimeter Sony lens. That's almost a $2,000 lens. So, you're going to be fairly serious about photography if you're making that investment. But there are ways around that. There are all-in-one zoom cameras that you can get that have somewhat smaller sensors. And the basic upshot of that is, even with a smaller camera, those allow you to get a very serious zoom range. You're going to lose a little bit of the quality that you might get with a real high-end camera, but you might be able to get a $1,000 or $700 all-in-one camera that really does allow you to get some interesting long-range wildlife images if you're going to Yellowstone or photographing deer or foxes or things like that.
Let's see. Aaron wants to know if either of you have worked with woodpeckers before.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah. Well, the
I have them in my
pileated.
backyard, so.
Are they particularly hard to work with?
I mean, I wouldn't say particularly. I mean, one of the nice things about woodpeckers is you can actually follow their drumming through the woods, which can be a great way to locate them. I would say, some of my best images of woodpeckers are actually out on a kayak. Um, and that's another tip I would give if you are interested in wildlife photography. Water is everything. Uh, Animals have to drink, and their birds are attracted to water. And I find that when I'm just gliding along in a kayak, that creatures have a really different reaction to me than if I approach them on land. Because you can just drift and be very silent. And I think because you're not making a lot of noise tromping through the woods, uh, a lot of animals just have a very different lower key reaction when I'm out in a kayak.
And there was also interest in if you all have worked with hummingbirds or dragonflies. I don't know if you have any pointers on photographing either of those. They both sound very flighty.
I can jump in quick. Yes, I've photographed both of them. One of the things I would say about dragonflies is they tend to have routines. And if you observe them for a while, you'll often see that they'll kind of move in a circular motion. Often they'll keep alighting on the same branch over and over again, but there might be 30 seconds between each time they land. So if you start to get their routine down, you can actually aim your camera just as they're about to land or take off and get some very dramatic images of their behavior.
I had no idea that they had a routine. I'll have to keep that in mind.
I agree with Stephen about the dragonflies. They tend, once you know their behaviors, you can just sit there and wait, and whenever they land, you can snap away.
Yep. I've even been able to get some of them in flight doing that same kind of technique. I will say, if you want the highest quality images, using a little bit of flash, even during the daytime, can stop their wing motion and give you the highest level of detail. Similar with hummingbirds. I mean, I found with hummingbirds, just getting a sense of where they're going to be. So there are certain plants in our backyard garden, like cardinal flower, that hummingbirds are really attracted to. So
Yes.
I go at the right time of day, I can get the lighting just right, aim my camera right at those cardinal flowers, and then it's just about patience, because it might take sitting there for an hour before the hummingbirds actually show up.
Yeah, hummingbirds is kind of my nemesis bird. I have yet to get a hummingbird picture that I've been satisfied with. So I have them in my yard, but I don't really photograph them. I photograph my butterflies instead. So
We have one more question, and it was about the use of blinds or stands. Have you all used any of those, and do you have any tips?
yeah, I have you'll find some photo blinds actually at national wildlife refuges that you can use. You can go in the photo blind. It's usually a wooden platform, and then they'll have the little windows. So you can shoot waterfowl like down in North Carolina at Alligator River. Excuse me, at Pea Island National Wildlife Refuge, I used to go down there and use their blind a lot and shoot the waterfowl. So, and I do have a portable blind, but I thought I might need it for my backyard. But my birds are just, they're used to me being outside. So I haven't actually have the need to use the portable blind for doing backyard bird photography.
I have a portable blind also, which I've used for bird photography. I will say I haven't used it a lot in recent years. Oftentimes I'll just kind of use natural cover objects as a blind, um, sitting behind a log, behind bushes, and that often works well too, without the more cumbersome setup, taking the blind with me.
Wonderful.
And yes, it's the same blind used by hunters. That's actually a good question because if you buy photo specific things, they'll often jack up the price, even though it's exactly the same thing. So if you get it from a hunting supply store instead, it's the same thing and you'll probably save a lot of money.
Yeah.
Very nice. Well, in our last 2 minutes, I wanted to give you each, if just a moment, if there was any parting wisdom that you hoped people would sort of take with them, one thing maybe that you really hope folks will remember or think about when they are out there snapping pictures.
I guess as I mentioned in my talk, it's for me, it's about relationship. Uh, we share the world with literally millions of other species, and we often don't give them much of a thought, and they're in a lot of trouble. So I think if photography can do something, it's raising that awareness about who we share the world with and why they're important. And it can be difficult to break through in the age of social media because we're flooded with images. So as a photographer, I try to be pretty selective about what I share, and hopefully the images that I put in my social media feeds and publish are the ones that get at this really relational aspect.
Yes, and I agree with Stephen about the respect and awareness of these creatures, whether they're a tiny shorebird, a mid-sized animal, an aquatic animal. They are decreasing. We do have a I don't say an issue with decreasing population of wildlife, and a lot of it's due to human environment. And we just need to be aware. Just be aware if you're out there. Just be respectful, and let the wildlife do what they do with their behaviors, and we continue on with our life, and hopefully we'll see an increase in population of a lot of birds that are endangered or threatened.
Wonderful. Well, we are at time, and what I wanted to do was thank both of you for all of your knowledge and your passion, and answering all of our questions. I'm sorry we couldn't make it to all of the questions today, but we'll also be sending out just a reminder recording of this webinar, and some follow-up information for everybody. So thank you all for coming and attending and asking great questions. And a big thank you to Lori and Stephen for coming and doing this for us. We really appreciate you sharing all of the great information that you have. And don't forget to donate to Wild Virginia.
Yes,
Tomorrow
please
is the last day on the
donate.
fundraiser.
Please donate. Thank you, Wild Virginia.
Thank both of you. Have a good night.
Good night.
Kylie, do we need to do anything else?
Nope, I think